So Terence "Bud" Crawford has officially beaten Canelo Alvarez by unanimous decision. Many thought it would be an impossible task. A few years ago I certainly would have thought it was impossible, but it has happened, and not only has it happened, it wasn't even close. Even with the famously corrupt judging in Canelo's fights, Crawford definitely won at least 8 of those rounds, as a 38-year-old jumping up 2 weight classes without even taking a tune-up fight. Now, I'm not normally someone who brags about getting predictions right, but I'm going to show you a clip from my most recent video, and even in hindsight it does explain how Crawford was able to beat Canelo. But since the Bivol fight, we've basically seen the opposite. In the final few rounds versus Bivol, who was basically useless, nothing he was throwing had any effect. He started really well in the trilogy versus Triple G, but then slowed down and lost the last 3. John Ryder got put down early on, but had his best moments in the last few rounds. There was no sense of growing danger from Canelo versus Jamel Charlo, even though Charlo was the same the entire fight. He was just trying to survive, but Canelo couldn't find a way around that. Jaime Munguia had some great rounds start to finish. Berlanga was growing in more confidence as the fight went on. William Skull was growing in more confidence as the fight went on. And this is all leading to the reason why I'm picking Terence Crawford to beat Canelo. Canelo simply doesn't impose himself as the bigger fighter enough to outwork someone who's a better boxer skill-wise. I do not believe the size difference is much of a factor. As long as Crawford is conditioned at 168, I think he can comfortably outbox Canelo behind the jab. Crawford is at his absolute best as a counterpuncher versus people with slow feet. The Canelo of recent years has been easier and easier to read as the fight goes on. Crawford has maybe the best mid-fight adjustment ability in all of boxing. I believe it goes the distance, it goes to a 116-112 decision, and that's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment, goodbye. And as it turns out, Crawford would indeed beat Canelo by 116-112 decision. And I do actually see it as the single greatest win in boxing history. But before we compare this to other wins in history, let's break down how it happened. Neither fighter was nervous at all in the ring walks. They're both professionals, they've both been in championship fights for over 10 years. The fight begins, and what I immediately notice is that Crawford is making an effort to be on the front foot. This is exactly the same thing Floyd Mayweather did in the Canelo fight. Floyd was just as small, if not smaller than Crawford in their fight, but he made an effort to make Canelo the first to take a backward step, basically saying, I know I'm the smaller fighter, but you are not in control. It doesn't matter how big you are, I will dictate where this fight goes. The best success Canelo had in this fight was with body shots. Because of Crawford's high guard, it was an obvious target for Canelo. But despite the weight difference and despite the weight that Canelo was putting on those punches, Crawford did not appear hurt by them whatsoever. The thing that surprised me the most about Crawford in this fight was just how good his guard was. I'd say over 95% of Canelo's attacks to the head were either blocked or parried by Crawford. And especially early on, these were not slow attacks from Canelo whatsoever. Canelo's hands are just as fast as they were 10 years ago. Crawford was so quick to put the hands up and to parry. The timing of those parries essentially took away the weight of the punches that Canelo was throwing. If Crawford had squared up and took the shots on the gloves like he did versus Spence, he would have absorbed a lot more force and done more damage, and also worn Crawford out. So he had to make sure he was either perfectly parrying the attack or moving away from it as Canelo throws. And that strategy was on point in this fight. Another very important factor was Crawford's fearlessness on the inside. What separates Crawford and Mayweather, who also did this same thing, from former opponents of Canelo, like Austin Trout, like Erislandy Lara, like Caleb Plant, and like William Skull, is that Crawford was willing to stand on the inside and counter. And not just counter once and move away, counter several times in the pocket. Anytime Canelo found himself on the inside, Crawford made sure he punished him for it. And whenever Canelo wasn't on the inside, Crawford made sure he was sticking him with the jab. This made Crawford superior on the outside and on the inside, which, very similar to the Floyd Mayweather fight, left Canelo in a sort of frustrating limbo, where there's no particular area Canelo has any success in. When Canelo did herd Crawford up to the ropes, there were moments where Canelo would slam a massive body shot into Crawford's body, but Canelo's lack of volume means he's not very good at trapping people on the ropes. He loads up and puts all his force into these single shots, so after the punch Crawford can simply move out. We have seen much better ability from Canelo to cut off the ring in the past. Versus Billy Joe Saunders, he was constantly feinting to keep him there. Versus Caleb Plant, he was framing with the lead hand before throwing. What may have prevented Canelo from doing this was how active Crawford was with his counters while off the ropes. He would suddenly plant his feet and land a southpaw left hand on the face of Canelo, which definitely would have made him second guess even more. The moment of the fight that really showed how in control Crawford was at the start of round 9. Canelo immediately comes out trying to impose himself and land a big right hand. Crawford pulls back, Canelo misses. Crawford then plants his feet, Canelo squares up. And with Canelo in range, Crawford hits him with a left hook, followed by a right hook, followed by a straight left, followed by a right hook to the body. Canelo returns fire, but Crawford's already out of range. And Crawford was throwing similar combinations throughout the entire fight. Canelo tries to close the distance, Crawford plants his feet and lands a combination and moves out. As we've seen from Canelo many times before, he looks very frustrated in this fight. Canelo has never really had that reckless aggression or that kill switch to beat someone like Crawford. Even if he is a bigger, more durable, more powerful fighter, he's too calculating and he second guesses himself too much. While Crawford was outboxing him, you never really saw rage or determination in Canelo, but rather annoyance. So while Canelo may still be in great shape, just as fast, just as powerful, he doesn't have quite the same hunger he used to do, which is natural, considering he's had about 70 fights. Canelo certainly knew he was down on the scorecards in the final round. Crawford could have easily coasted and circled and ran until the end of the fight. By that point he was way up on the scorecards, but you can never be certain with the judges, so Crawford remained planting his feet and landed a massive counter left hand on the chin of Canelo. It was perfectly timed, Canelo was moving straight into it, but Canelo still didn't go down. Canelo was somewhat close to going down though in the dying seconds of the fight, as he caught Canelo with a left hook as Canelo was trying to throw his own. Canelo staggered and his knees dipped, and watching live I thought Canelo was on his way to going down. But Canelo's chin remains a biological marvel and the fight goes the distance, and Crawford is declared the winner, 115-113, 115-113 and 116-112. Just to put into perspective how much Crawford's done in his career, he won his first world title almost 12 years ago versus Ricky Burns in the 135-pound division, defended that title twice including versus Yuriorkis Gamboa, moved up to 140 and fought for a vacant world title versus Thomas Delorme, defended twice then unified versus WBC champion Victor Postol, defended 2 more times then unified versus fellow unified champion Julius Ndongo to become undisputed, moves up to his 3rd weight class 147 and wins a title versus Jeff Horn, defends that title 6 times including a knockout win over Sean Porter, then unifies all the belts at 147 versus fellow unified champion Errol Spence Jr., who was top 5 pound for pound at the time, and clearly the best win of Crawford's career by this point. I do not buy the excuses that Spence was somehow vulnerable leading into the fight versus Crawford because of his car accidents, which led to the fight being more one-sided. Following the 2 car crashes, Spence had already beaten 2 certified world-level, almost elite-level world champions in Danny Garcia and Yordenis Ugas, which in my opinion is Spence's best performance. I think Crawford was quite simply a horrendous matchup for Spence. He's then undisputed in his 2nd division. He moves up again to his 4th weight division, 154, defeats undefeated defending champion Israel Madrimov by decision. Then a full year later jumps up 2 weight classes, skips the 160-pound division and moves all the way up to 168 to face the undisputed defending champion Canelo Alvarez, making him the first 3-time undisputed champion in boxing history, a 5-division champion, 42 wins and no losses. Now there are some detractors in Crawford's record, mainly because there isn't a high volume of elite wins on his record. A lot of his title defences were versus B-tier opponents, but the Canelo win does speak for itself. And the fact that Crawford doesn't really have a close fight on his record does also speak for itself. If you've been keeping up with my resume videos, the leaderboard needs tweaking. Before the Canelo fight, Crawford's resume had a score of 91. With the Canelo fight, he goes up 20 points, so that makes him above Mike Tyson in any way, and just below Usyk. And funnily enough, still below Canelo himself. Mainly because Canelo has been so much more active than Crawford has. So now the question becomes, is this really the greatest win in boxing history? To go through some other contenders for best win in recent years, Usyk's win last year over Tyson Fury was very impressive. Manny Pacquiao being someone who started his career at 105 pounds to then move up to 154 and face Antonio Margarito, a fight where he's blatantly undersized but wins almost every single round afterwards anyway. Muhammad Ali over George Foreman is a historical win. Roy Jones Jr. immediately jumping from light heavyweight all the way to heavyweight in the space of 6 months to face champion John Ruiz, but none of those wins I actually consider SS tier wins. I've given that rare distinction to only 4 fights, including Crawford versus Canelo, the first of which being Michael Spinks over Larry Holmes, where Spinks immediately jumps from light heavyweight all the way to heavyweight, to defeats the 8-year-long undefeated reigning defending champion Larry Holmes. Roberto Duran's win over Sugar Ray Leonard, Duran being someone who started at 130 pounds, to then move into welterweight and beating a prime Sugar Ray Leonard. Then in my opinion the best win in boxing history, Sugar Ray Leonard over Marvin Hagler. Leonard being someone who is a career welterweight, suffering a detached retina in 1982, which almost caused him to retire. He's out of action for 2 years. He comes back to have a tune-up fight versus Kevin Howard, but the injury flares up again, so he has to take another 3 years out of the ring. That return fight in question would be his first ever fight at 160 pounds versus defending middleweight champion Marvin Hagler, who was coming off a long streak of wins featuring Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns and John Mugabe. The odds were against Leonard in almost every single way, but he won the fight anyway. But I do also understand if you don't count it as a win, if you don't think Leonard won the fight, which is entirely understandable. It was a very close fight. I personally had it a draw. So if you want to disqualify that and only count wins that are clear, you would have to count Crawford's win last night over Canelo as the best win of all time. Not only did Crawford start at 135 pounds, he'd only just moved up to 154 last year and only had one fight in that division. He could have taken a tune-up at 160, but chose to jump up 2 weight classes entirely and face the undisputed best fighter in the division, Canelo Alvarez. Win the fight, and it wasn't even close. Now may be the right time to have a laugh at some of the narratives before the fight about Crawford. If you're someone who's picking Crawford to win the fight, you will have heard this many times. Like this guy saying that everyone picking Crawford is objectively wrong and biased. The whole close fight versus Madrimov argument. There's a very clear reason as to why I did not bring up the Israel Madrimov fight in my prediction for the fight versus Canelo. Israel Madrimov and Canelo Alvarez could not be further apart in style. Canelo's feet are very slow, Madrimov's feet are very light. Madrimov throws a lot of punches with not much force. Canelo throws single shots with lots of force. Canelo is a pressure fighter with a high guard. Madrimov's hands are low and he's a back foot fighter. Styles do indeed make fights. I also want to point out the amount of comments I've received complaining about how Canelo is in the A++ tier and not the S tier in my resume videos. I cannot have the opinion that a boxer in the super middleweight division loses to a career welterweight if he's an S tier fighter. An S tier fighter is almost unbeatable in their weight class, and as we just saw, Canelo is not unbeatable in his weight class and certainly not versus welterweights. So finally there's a question now of what does Crawford do next? The opponent that's been lingering around Crawford's name for the longest is Jaron Boots Ennis, but Boots does not have a title at 154, and I don't think Crawford is going to move all the way back down to 154 either, especially after bulking up to 168 and being 38 years old. Janabek is the best fighter at 160, but then again, not really a big money fight. Turki Al-Sheikh may want him to face Hamza Shiraz or Chris Eubank Jr., or if Crawford feels really brave, he could move all the way up to 175 and face Dimitri Bivol to become a 4-division undisputed champion. But ultimately what I think Bud should do is retire. The Canelo win is such a high note and there's not really any big fights at 168 anymore. He's done practically everything he can and there's nothing more to prove. Canelo on the other hand may unfortunately end up facing Jake Paul. I don't want it to happen, but unfortunately it may happen. Overall, just to recap this weekend, Terence Crawford just got a historical win. Callum Walsh is as mid as he's ever been. Why was he co-main over Christian Mbili versus Lester Martinez, the best fight of the year? Brandon Adams upsets Sergey Boachuk in the rematch. Lewis Crocker won a robbery decision over Paddy Donovan in the rematch. Crocker is clearly the worst champion in boxing right now. And anyway, that's going to do it for the video. I hope Crawford's win inspires more young boxers to take more risks, jump up weight classes, and take fights they're not supposed to take. I'm not pointing towards any boxers in particular. His name definitely doesn't start with a G, and it definitely doesn't end with Avonte Tank Davis. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.